Okay, so I just recorded and my mic was muted, so hopefully it's not muted. I looked at the lexical approach to teaching English. I thought this looked interesting. It's has 3 key points. There's a focus on vocabulary and much less of a focus on grammar. It also teaches through something called lexical chunks, as the name implies, which are structures made up of words or clusters of words. For example, to take a risk, heavy rain, and later on I'll get into the types of chunks, but basically you can use these chunks in many situations. So like to take a risk, to take a shower, to take a break, and that's why it's useful to teach this way. And lastly, it has a focus on acquisition, natural acquisition through task, input, immersion, and it's called noticing the lexicals. That's what the immersion does. So they're not really taught explicitly, more so through immersion. So essentially, this theory believes that if students become aware of many lexical structures, they'll have a lot more information about how to combine words to build structures like phrases and expressions and sentences, which should eventually lead to them being able to speak natively. And just an example from native speakers often make grammar mistakes. However, they do have a mastery of lexical patterns, and that this teaching method kind of mirrors that. I thought was interesting. Why does this work? Language has more structures than that of just grammar, so the lexical structures is another layer to the patterns of language, another way to look at it than just through grammar. It's also foundational. So, like I said, if you make a grammar mistake, you can still understand it in the right context. But if you make a lexical mistake, you're likely to be misunderstood. Additionally, studies have also shown that learners tend to notice and remember words better in chunks. And lastly, we learn in chunks because individual words can change their meaning depending on words that they're grouped with. So if you learn it in chunks, it kind of it makes more sense if you learn them in chunks rather than being confused about the meaning. It gives more context. So there's around 300,000 chunks. It's way too much to teach them all. So the teaching approach should focus on acquisition of most of them rather than explicitly teaching lexical chunks. Students will learn them on their own, acquire them on their own. The teacher's role will be to help the students notice them and develop that skill of noticing the chunks. And I mean, that's how acquisition happens. You just notice the patterns, except in this case it's lexical chunks. And so you would do activities, reading, writing, etc. The vocabulary should not be taught out of context. Just some types of lexical chunks. There's collocations, which is just 2 words, like from the main parts of speech, like a verb, an adjective, run fast, adjective, noun. It's very common. Fixed expressions, like idioms or polite phrases. These won't be as useful to teach because they're not as flexible, but they can still be taught. And then we have semi-fix, which this is going to be most of them here, the most useful one to teach, because students can, well, it's essentially an expression which at least one slot can have a number of different words and phrases. Like the example before, what was it? To take a break, to take a shower. So that's very, very useful. You can acquire a lot of language through these. An example lesson, you can use it with any method, this approach. So I'm just going to do the PPP method. You start with a presentation of a reading or audio or video, and you help the students notice the chunks, and underline them, highlight them, and explain their meaning. Then the students will practice with the chunks, and maybe a matching activity, maybe some kind of game, fill in the blank. And then for production, the students will use the chunk in a conversation, speaking activity, writing activity, and then the teacher can give feedback on that. And then an example activity, I think it was from an article. I think this was a task-based activity. It's a little complicated, but firstly, you give students input, like a reading, and then you tell them that they'll use the language later that's in the reading, so they're very attentive now. And then they'll start looking for expressions, useful expressions as a read that they could use later. They'll look for chunks, and then the teacher will put some of these chunks on the board and show how you can switch certain words in them to create your own unique phrase, fill in the blank, fill in the slot basically. And then the student will be asked to maybe do an activity based off the initial reading or whatever, with the same kind of theme. So if it was about holidays, you can ask them to write about their own holiday or talk about their own holiday using some of the chunks that they learned, just in their own way. So this gives them practice with the chunks, helps them notice the chunks, immersion, and then if you want to make it fun, you can require them to use a certain number of chunks, or have some kind of competition who can use the most chunks, and then you can do peer or teacher scoring or corrections. Thank you.